are back on the 0 Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Joining us once again, it's been quite a while, is Vijay Prashad. Vijay is the author of a number of books, including Washington Bullets, which we discussed on this show some time ago. He is also a prolific essayist and commentator and journalist who travels the world constantly. And his most recent book is a series of dialogues with Noam Chomsky entitled The Withdrawal. So I'm looking forward to speaking with him again. Vijay Prashad, welcome back to the program.
It's a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Before we get into what I originally contacted you about, so what is the premise of the book for those of us who would like to read it?
Well, it's quite simple, really. The United States got entangled, that's a funny way of saying it, in three major wars. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Libya. And in each of these countries, in one way or the other, the United States had to withdraw without, on the surface of it, its war aims established. Now, people can debate, what was the war aim of entering Afghanistan in the first place? So we looked at these three conflicts, and we basically found patterns in them. The book is structured around a conversation, but really, Chomsky and I have been working on this for a while, and this was just a way to get the material in a kind of readable format. We were very seized of the fact that younger people might not know some of the hidden details, let's say, of these conflicts, and we wanted to create a book that wasn't going to be, overly difficult to read. And that's why we did it in a dialogue format, although we had sort of worked out the lines of inquiry previously. For instance, that in each of these conflicts, the United States had an opportunity to negotiate and rejected negotiation. In Afghanistan, Iraq, and in Libya. Rejected negotiation out of hand, clobbered these countries, which is why we, maybe accurately call the United States the Godfather. There's a kind of Godfather attitude. And the word Godfather plays a big role in this book, that the Godfather was forced to withdraw. What does this then say about the level of US power? And we come out with a slightly different take than those in the middle of a debate about, the enduringness of US power, the kind of people who say it can constantly revitalize itself. And then the declinists, those who say that US power is declining. We come in the middle here. I think neither of those two are accurate assessments of where the United States is. Where it is, we use the word fragility. There is a kind of fragility in the power of the United States. Certainly not declining, and it's certainly not what it used to be, but there is a kind of fragility. So that's, in essence, the book. But really, it's a kind of romp through recent history for younger audiences and those who want to refresh their memory.
So I look forward to reading it. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that too at some point. I do have to say, however, that I think you and Professor Chomsky may have disparaged the Godfather a little bit with that analogy, though, because as I recall, the Godfather, if we're talking about the prototypical novel and movie Godfather, would engage in negotiations from time to time.
Of course, it was called a sit down, and that's what Chomsky and I joke that, in fact, this Godfather doesn't even do the sit down. Although I must say that, your and my understanding of the mafia is entirely from pop fiction, including The Sopranos. But even when they had the sit down, the big boss brought their guns with them. They brought their heavies and they sort of circled the table. Well, that kind of thing to some extent happens at the United Nations. They allow the minor people to show up, but then they come with the big guns. So yeah, of course, I get it. This Godfather, the United States government doesn't even negotiate. And so it's straight to the severed horse head then.
Now, I don't want to divert the conversation too much, but I did have a personal run-in with the mafia at one point in my life. Other than that, it's all from the media. But I said something on the radio when I was a musician that they didn't find amusing, and they communicated to me that fact. And that's all it was the boys didn't think it was funny, but that was all I needed. So, okay, so we will look forward to reading that book. One last question about it, The Withdrawal. It suggests a certain conclusion. Obviously, the U.S. was forced to withdraw from all three countries. So why The Withdrawal as a title?
Well, it's provocative because, in fact, there was no complete withdrawal. In Afghanistan, the United States is holding the funds of the Afghan government,
Right.
in that sense, still intervening. That's $10 billion, a lot of money for a country experiencing about 95% hunger and poverty. That's 95% of their population. In Iraq, there is no real full withdrawal because the US still operates in northern Iraq, just as it operates across the border in Syria. Well, in Libya, perhaps there is some measure of withdrawal, but there's political influence on the one government in Tripoli against the other government in Benghazi. It's a provocative title because it's not just the withdrawal from these countries, which significant troop removal has taken place. So it's not that there was no withdrawal. It's also about the United States withdrawal from its position as being the primus inter pares, the leading force in the world. The last section of the book is on China and the US government's relationship with its own reality, understanding that, as the US government itself says, that China is a power that threatens the international order, by which they mean United States power. And in the book, we play a lot with this phrase the US government uses called rules-based international order. Effectively, the rules are constructed in Washington. It's not truly global, and let's admit that. So The Withdrawal is a provocative title. We hope it'll, spur debate and discussion. We're trying to come into that debate again between the declinists and the people who believe US power is eternal. And, I just think that debate is so arid as it stands because it's bifurcated and people don't really see that there's much more complexity involved.
Well, and of course, you did the book before the U.S. became involved in Ukraine, another situation where the evidence suggests strongly, to me anyway, that the U.S. declined several opportunities to negotiate before, over a period of years before getting involved. So perhaps you'll be writing a sequel one of these days as well.
Well, we've actually covered some of this at the close of the book because we had the chance to reflect on the February 23rd entry of Russian troops into Ukraine. But let me just say, and I think this is really important, the current issue of Foreign Affairs magazine has a piece by Fiona Hill and Angela Stechter, I think her name is, both establishment US journalists writing in foreign affairs, not in, the newspaper of a far left tendency. In this article, where they basically skewer the history of Vladimir Putin, there's a paragraph which caught my attention, where they mention that in April of 2022, the Russians and the Ukrainians actually cut an interim peace deal. The peace deal would have forced the Russians to withdraw troops to the pre-February lines, and Ukraine would make a public declaration saying no NATO for us. Well, that's really interesting. It's the first time I've seen well, let's not say this is evidence of, but at least a mainstream publication making a claim that there was in fact an interim peace deal between the two parties to this conflict. Well, Boris Johnson, at the time the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, showed up in Kiev, put the pressure on Mr. Zelensky, Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and Ukraine walked away from the deal. That's very interesting evidence. It suggests to us that, it's true what people had been saying, that the Russians and Ukrainians in good faith were negotiating in Ankara. They were negotiating on the Belarus border. And then the NATO countries, in this case led by the United Kingdom, came in and said, sorry, no negotiating allowed. Ukraine is going to have to win this fight. It strikes me as rather crazy, Richard, that anybody can believe that this war can be won. Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the UK's Labour Party, he says pretty plainly that all wars end in negotiation. So rather than fight a war,
Right.
why not negotiate now? Well, the reason people fight a war is to change the facts on the ground. If you change the facts on the ground, then your negotiating position improves. Well, that's why people don't immediately negotiate. They allow for some war to take place. Of course, great loss of life and suffering and so on, just to change some facts on the ground. The Russians, by April, had changed some facts on the ground. They had established that they had control over the Donbass region. They had, in fact, incorporated the whole of that region. And they were building a land bridge from the Russian territory to Crimea. That had not been completed in April. In fact, at the time, if the deal had stuck, then Mariupol may not have been in Russian hands, and so on and so forth. So we have evidence there and in so many other instances where, the United States, pushing some of its allies, simply says, we don't want peace. We don't want to work towards peace. We want to use warfare, maximum use of warfare, to get our way. And in this case, you don't have to take my word for it. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said it at a press conference. He said the point of this conflict, the United States supporting the government in Ukraine, was to weaken Russia. That's a phrase he used, weaken Russia. Seems to me everybody's playing with fire here, and that worries me a great deal. A peace agreement in April, that's just a few months into the war. Now we are into the 7th month of the war. That should have been welcomed by everybody. Unfortunately not, and it was suppressed. We only heard about it in September, accidentally, the margins of an article which was not about this, but about saying that Putin is a nutcase.
And Fiona Hill, who you mentioned, is not just an objective journalist. She was, as I recall, a long career supporting John Bolton and other members of the neoconservative pro-war faction, some of whom have been incorporated into Biden's foreign policy structure. But this is not even a neutral journalist dropping this fact. This is a very conservative, pro-war journalist dropping this is kind of nothing. And lest we forget, Vladimir Zelensky ran for president as a peace candidate, as a negotiation candidate. So something clearly changed along the way, right?
Quite right. I mean, listen, Richard, you said it. I didn't want to bring this up. I wanted to leave Fiona Hill's antecedents off the table because, after all, she wrote this for Foreign Affairs, which is an establishment journal and so on. But you're quite right. I mean, Fiona Hill is not a nobody. She has the ear of people in the national security establishment. She hears a lot of things which you and I may not hear. The only access I have to U.S. national security is ex-CIA people who want to come and cry into their beer, telling you stories because they feel bad about what they had done. I don't have any contacts inside the national security state as it is running, because those people don't have the regrets that they will generate later, and then they come and talk to us. So Fiona Hill is talking to people like that. So I actually think that paragraph in Foreign Affairs is a highly credible claim. Again, I said it comes with no evidence because it's just a claim they make. They describe the deal. They don't show us the piece of paper or anything. But, if I was the editor of the New York Times or the Washington Post, I would immediately have that in the newspaper saying, what's this? Hello. We haven't been paying attention, but of course.
Which is why you're not the editor of the New York Times or the Washington Post.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Right? I mean, so the fact is, and this points to, I guess, the broader topic I wanted to get to, which is I still think it's difficult for people in this country and Western Europe, UK perhaps more so, a lot of times, even good, smart people who care and try to stay on top of the news, but have a million things to do. I think it's sometimes hard for that pattern recognition to set in exactly what we're talking about. In this case, it's, by the way, I found that paragraph 2 and 4 in the Fiona Hill article, and I kind of read it. And, wait, what did you just say? It was, but the fact that not been refuted, certainly, and there have been plenty of time to say, oh, we got it wrong. The fact that saw the light of day, but was not publicized by other news outlets. That is not a mistake to me. That is an ongoing pattern. The fact that Judith Miller at the New York Times could get the story of what was going on in Iraq so wrong, and that got through. Again, I mean, all these, we could point to a million things in war and environment, which I want to get to in a second, and everything else, but it seems to me that it's getting better, but I think, it's a matter of letting people know that it's not spooky or strange or conspiracy-ish to just say, look, there is a pattern underway here, whether it's, Gore Vidal used the phrase a conspiracy of shared values, but whatever it is, stories don't get printed, stories do get printed, stories get printed with a slant to them, and those of us who try to point that out sometimes are treated like we're on the fringe, but really it's the mainstream media that's on the fringe of reality. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Well, look, in the withdrawal, Noam and I focus in on one of these things. You see, on August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein sent his troops into Kuwait, invaded Kuwait. Well, he claimed that the US ambassador, April Glaspie, gave him a green light and so on. Okay. The United States came out and said, this is outrageous invasion of Kuwait. There was all kinds of things happening, including claims being made about atrocities in Kuwait. Later, many of them disproved, and so on and so forth. But right after that, by about October or so, the government in Iraq started to make offers. Actually, the first offer came in August itself. In the second or third week of August, Saddam Hussein made an entreaty to the United States government saying, look, if the Israelis withdraw from Israel, then I'll withdraw from Kuwait. Something absurd, totally absurd, unlikely, impossible. Well, that was his first approach, and the letter was carried to Washington. It was declined. Then he later said, look, just give me an honorable way to leave. Now, what's interesting is these two entreaties made by Saddam Hussein, one in August 1990 and the second later in the year, were not reported in the New York Times, even though the Times was given the letter, even though they were shown the letter. They declined to report it. They declined to report, in other words, that there was a negotiation possible. You know who reported this? There was some reporting in the Arab world, but interestingly, Newsday in Long Island carried the story on the 29th of August, 1990. Newsday in Long Island, a tabloid, carried the story.
Right.
The person who took the file to the New York Times was rejected, turned around and gave it to Newsday. So it was in the public record by the 29th of August, 1990, that Saddam Hussein was seeking a way to negotiate. If you go and look at the New York Times, it suggests that the Iraqis were obdurate, refusing to leave Kuwait. This is not true. The public record, not in papers in Iraq, not in papers in Iran or places you might not believe, but for God's sake, Newsday. Now, you might say, well, it's a tabloid, except that Knut Royce, the journalist who wrote the story, is a highly respected person, and he did a terrific bunch of stories. So what's the thing here? Well, this is the conspiracy of shared values in a way that Gore Vidal talks about, except that there are always one or two people who don't share those values. Knut Royce sitting in Newsday, mainstream publication. On the other end of the United States, Gary Webb. Remember Gary Webb?
Of course, yeah.
Yes, the San Jose Mercury. People who just, journalists who just were too dogged holding on to stories, trying to get the reality out there. And then they sort of disappear, I can list for you names of people that I have known journalists who covered with me in Iraq and Afghanistan who either just lost it because their editors in the United States refused to publish what they were sending in or rewrote what they were sending in, or, they simply couldn't get their stories into the press. They were constantly spiked and so on. We don't hear much about all that, and that's because, well, what Gore Vidal called the conspiracy of shared values, or what I think in another society might be called, well, I don't know, it's an ugly word, but it's a form of censorship.
Well, sure. Oh, I think it is a form of, people, the simplistic model of censorship is a government employee comes in and draws a red line through certain words. But if you pre-screen for journalists who will only report in a certain way, for, Chris Hedges having to leave the New York Times or whatever it is, if you pre-screen for a certain form of journalism, if you have certain types of editors, then official government sponsorship or censorship rather becomes unnecessary. And I think, Vijay, that this extends to coverage of, you wrote a piece recently about the variations in lithium power politics in South America, in Chile and Bolivia. And this to me is very related in the sense that when political events are covered in this country, in Bolivia, in Chile, elsewhere, and there are strong financial and strategic interests the U.S. has with those countries. Lithium production, for example, being a vital interest, so-called considered. I think 35 minerals in total have been designated by the CIA and the State Department as having vital interest to the United States. Lithium being probably close to or at the top of the list. I think we have a tendency in this country not to understand what's at play here and to downplay our own attempts to interfere, often successful, in the histories of these countries, or the significance of when our influence is diminished in these countries, if there's the election of a government that opposes what the U.S. is trying to do. I think, to me, I see a through line here. Do you?
Well, look, on the 4th of September, Sunday, the Chilean people went to look at their constitution, whether to approve or reject it. Turned out, of course, that the new constitution was rejected pretty resoundingly, 60% to 40%. I'm not entirely surprised by it, but that's a separate issue. That very day, the Washington Post published an editorial about this act of democracy in Chile. You know what the first word of that editorial was? It's incredible. This is an editorial about the Chilean people going to have a new constitution, and the first word of the editorial was lithium, because the editorial proceeded to say, lithium is one of the world's blah, 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 and Chile has the largest holdings of lithium. And the Washington Post was concerned that this new constitution was going to give the Chilean people too much democratic control over their own resources. It's incredible. We are almost at 50 years since the US initiated coup against the government of Salvador Allende. That was since 1973. That coup took place because in 1972, precisely 50 years ago, Allende nationalized the copper reserves. The copper reserves sit in the Atacama Desert, the southern part of it largely. Lithium is largely in slightly northern part of the Atacama Desert. Taroa Zuniga Silva and I traveled through the Atacama Desert in the last few months. We've been doing a series of stories about what we saw there. We were interested in, what's going on with lithium, because it's such a key part of the debate in South America. The three countries, the ABC countries, as it were, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, have the largest holdings in this sort of what's called the lithium triangle. But Richard, I hate phrases like that because it reduces places where human beings live to resources. At any rate, we couldn't get actually to where the lithium is mined because it's all private corporations. One of the largest corporations operating in the lithium area is owned by General Augusto Pinochet's son-in-law. He is one of the billionaires who owns basically a large tract of lithium in Chile. It's just obscene, that occurs. Chile, like many countries of its kind, endowed with a lot of minerals and metals, essentially just lets the minerals slip through the fingers. They don't process
Right.
it at all. They just let it go. And so the royalties they earn is limited. When I interviewed Giorgio Jackson, who is effectively the chief of staff of the president of Chile, he said that. He said that we need to get more value added from our minerals. I mean, they need to have a better mineral policy. Well, part of that was in the new constitution, which was rejected by the voters. In Bolivia, you cross the border. Evo Morales basically came to power on a resource nationalist agenda. Lithium was a piece of this, although secondarily, when he came to power, lithium was not the big thing on the table. Eventually, under his leadership and now under Luis Arce, Bolivia developed an incredible policy of essentially ground to electric car. Bolivia produces an electric car, extremely poor country, produces a small electric car which is just a little bigger than a golf cart. But for Bolivian streets, it's just fine. It's actually quite a good vehicle to have. It's like those mini cars that you see sometimes in the advanced industrial countries. Okay, so you got a big difference. You got this extremely poor country, but of course, to develop anything requires a large capital infusion.
Sure.
And here comes your choices. You either go to Western mining companies, Canadian, US mining companies, Swiss mining companies, but they generally like to make you take debt. They like to debt finance their mining operations. They're very conservative with their own money. That's one choice. The other is the Chinese. The Chinese show up and they actually don't often debt finance mining. They come in and they invest in it directly. Well, here we come to the new Cold War between the United States and China. Immense pressure placed on Bolivia and on Chile and on Argentina not to allow the Chinese to essentially invest commercially in a commercial entity. In other words, basic commerce has to be stopped because the United States, the godfather, just doesn't allow it. By the way, if you haven't watched a good Netflix series in a long while, I highly recommend the third series of Borgen, which is a Danish show about a prime minister, Brigitte Nyborg. And in the third series, it's about Greenland, which has discovered oil, and a Chinese company comes in to basically owns the new oil prospect. And the United States says you have to get the Chinese out of there. Very interesting show. It's a contemporary show, contemporary political thing. And it actually does a good job of showing the kind of godfather attitude of US officials.
Oh, we watched the first two seasons of Borgen, Borgen. For those of you who are listening, we'll have to check out the third. It sounds more interesting, actually. And again, going back in terms of lithium, and of course, most people know lithium is vitally important for batteries, for electronic equipment, like the kind used in computers and so on. So, an important part of the industrial world as it exists today. It strikes me that the New York Times, their first word was lithium when it came to the rejection of the Chilean progressive constitution, but it was not, for example, campaign cash, because my understanding of that vote, that referendum, was that the Constitution was significantly doing well in the polls, but that an enormous amount of private money was used to affect the outcome of that vote. Is that your understanding?
It's very complicated. This is the first election with mandatory voting. And I'm not sure it was such a good idea to put a constitution to test on a kind of new election or new electoral policy. Previously, all those who registered to vote had to vote. It was mandatory if you registered to vote. Well, now people are automatically registered to vote when you get to the age. And so voting is now mandatory. Well, you're bringing in a large number of people to the ballot box who may not be, active politically and so on. I mean, I think there's a lot of factors involved. It's not just the cash. There's a lot of factors involved. The current government, I think, didn't sufficiently campaign for the constitution, didn't explain to the people what was in there. Gabriel Boric, the president, had an enormous pulpit. He could have come in there and spoken quite fiercely about what was going on. He simply wanted to be neutral, as it were. And you can't be neutral in this situation. It's going to undermine his own government, So all of this, it's a very complicated business in one sense. But look, we're talking about lithium, we're talking about green technology. Let's face it, there's great concern that a lot of this green transition that's going to take place is going to happen on the backs of indigenous people who live above the land, which has these metals and minerals. They're not going to benefit very much, from it. So basically, the new metals and minerals of the green technology are going to be like the old fuels, in terms of creating social inequality. Like, how many people who live above oil actually make money from the oil? Just the Gulf Arab states, the desert Arabs, there are just a few of them. In fact, if you look at Saudi Arabia, a vast mass of the Saudi working class is imported workers. They don't benefit from the oil underfoot. So in the same way, these indigenous communities, and it happens to be largely indigenous communities in Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, in that area where the countries meet, where the lithium sits, they're not going to benefit greatly. They're benefiting more than if there was nothing underfoot, but not greatly, and these replications of the old patterns, just because it's called green energy doesn't mean it's good energy. It can be produced in terrible ways. I mean, one has to be concerned, for instance, about the way in which water is used in the extraction of lithium. Enormous amount of water. Water is polluted. By the way, one of the people who helped write the Constitution, one of the Constituent Assembly members from that region, is a scientist who has tracked for many years the decline of the pink flamingo in the Atacama Desert. They're dying out. Why? Because the water is toxic now. These things should be of concern to people. And maybe you scoff and say, pink flamingo, it's a plastic toy in front of people's home. No, this is a real animal and part of our ecosystem. And it's being slowly rendered extinct because of this urgency for a green transition without a consciousness of what justice, equality, a kind of sustainable consciousness might be.
And, you wrote about this too in a recent piece for the tricontinental.org, but it's not at all clear to me that any kind of genuinely green carbon reducing transition can take place under, corporate capitalist guidance, because they're always going to take the shortcut, which is the resource intensive, damaging way. And it may be green in the sense that it doesn't spew carbon into the atmosphere, but may be destructive in many other ways, like the ways you mentioned.
Well, let's leave all those for a minute, Richard. The fact is that private firms, energy firms and so on, simply don't want to invest their own money into the transition. These private companies want the public, the governments to underwrite the transition, and then they will profit by it. Well, why not cut out the private company? Why not have the government, in effect, underwrite the transition, and then the government create parastatal bodies, non-profit bodies that run these entities? It's in Bolivia, it works pretty well. For a very poor country with, not the highest level of technical skill right across the population. Nonetheless, the private sector firm that manages, resources does pretty well. Of course, there will be cases of corruption and so on. That happens in private sector firms as well. It's not like the private sector is immune from corruption. Anybody who's worked in Wall Street knows that corruption is endemic. Recently, I read that the CFO of Bed Bath & Beyond committed suicide because he made a deal with another person and they basically pumped and dumped the stock of Bed Bath & Beyond. This kind of petty corruption, which has real implications, by the way, Bed Bath & Beyond, I read, as a consequence of this, is going to close down a whole bunch of its shops because they lost a lot of money in the pump and dump scheme, for which the CFO committed suicide. So it's not like corruption is somehow only in the state sector. Corruption is endemic in the private sector. We just don't call it corruption. We just say it's, well, individual acts of fraud. No, there are individual acts of fraud in public and in private. That has to do with the problem of the human consciousness. We are not evolved enough, frankly, to be above fraud and using nepotism and all kinds of things that are just there, part of the current level of human development. But I still feel like, what's the point of cutting the private sector into the deal when all it's doing is using public money to make its money? I mean, they're
Which
not
is
necessarily there.
Which is exactly what the pharmaceutical industry does, especially here in this country, where the public will fund the development of new drugs, which will then, the patents will be given to pharmaceutical companies that charge so much people die because they can't afford it. It's very similar to me. So I think we have a very similar vision of the future where the people need to do it and the people need to democratically govern it. And there's, if it's going to be as expensive as they tell us, then we certainly can't afford a 15 or 20% profit margin on top of that going to people who haven't done the work.
And also, the argument, and I know we're dancing around to various things, but they're all about the same thing. The argument that somehow the private sector is more efficient is nonsense. It's utterly nonsense. I mean, companies have all institutions have a tendency to bloat and to create inefficiencies. The private sector is as inefficient as anything. Look at the financial crisis, 2007 to 2009, just that period. When we go back and look at those banks, the level of inefficiency in those banks, the level of sending out young people to get mortgages signed, and then nobody in the back office being able to manage all those things, do a proper analysis. I mean, Bear Stearns and the other one that collapsed,
Lehman Brothers, yeah.
Lehman Brothers, were they efficient companies? If they were efficient, they wouldn't have collapsed like that. So, but those stories don't taint the idea of the private sector. The public sector has taken a beating as an idea, and that's largely because of interests at play in the private sector. They have some control over the media, whatever it is. But if you look at the facts, no institution by itself is efficient. No institution by itself is going to be able to do things excellently. They all suffer from the lack of whatever human beings, or the goodness of whatever human beings are there, the leadership that's there, the organization, and so on. I mean, I've seen extremely well organized public sector concerns. By the way, the British Health Service, for many years until the defunding from Thatcher onward, British Health Service is a very well managed public sector enterprise. The BBC, for all its scandals and problems, pretty well managed. I'm not saying they have good news, appalling news coverage, but it's a well managed public sector. It's a parastatal entity, It's pretty well managed.
In the United States, Social Security, first and largest social insurance program in this country, extremely well managed despite all sorts of attempts to squeeze its budget, extremely popular, well liked. Medicare, in this country, one of our better run, although there's been much too much intrusion of the private sector into it, making it worse. So drug coverage under Medicare, drug coverage under Medicare, which is run by the private sector, far less efficient than the primary health coverage. So absolutely, I think we agree on two things, I think, at least, which is the usefulness of these publicly run services, whether for environment or other, and that the media, mainstream media, has been putting its thumb on the scale in terms of public perception on this for a very long time. But I'll give you the last word.
Well, no, I just want to say that, that's the reason why when I reported with Tarawa Zuniga Silva, when we reported the story from Chile, we added in our second story, the tale in Bolivia, because there is a stark comparison between the management of the lithium in Chile and the management of the lithium in Bolivia. And that's precisely what we're talking about. Of course, we're going to extract these metals and minerals from the earth. Of course, that's going to happen. The question is, how do you manage it? And who benefits from the extraction of these metals and minerals? We talked to somebody in Chile who said it's so mismanaged. There needs to be a moratorium on the mining right now. It's been so mismanaged. I got to tell you, traveling through the Atacama Desert, it really does feel mismanaged. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful parts of the world, and it's being thoroughly destroyed, systematically destroyed by these mining companies. And I want people to know that 60% of the world's mining companies are incorporated in Canada. So don't have some high opinion of the Canadian people. More than half of the world's mining companies are in Canada. The rest are in the United States, Switzerland, Australia, China, and so on. China is a minority compared to some of these other countries. So next time you say, if Trump comes back in the United States, I'm moving to Canada, think again.
Well, I like Joni Mitchell and Neil Young, but the rest of those Canadians better shape up. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Vijay Prashad of the tricontinental.org, his latest book is The Withdrawal with Noam Chomsky. Thank you so much for all your great reporting, and thanks for coming back on the program. Great to talk with you again.
It's a pleasure, Richard. Thanks a lot, and enjoy your guitars.
Well, thank you. I certainly will. And now I have to explain that to the radio audience. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.